so happy to be here with you today.
Hi, Melissa. Thank you. Me too. I'm super excited.
Hey. So
Yeah,
I'm particularly happy to have you here on the summit because you were actually, whether you know it or not, one of the first people who introduced the concept of high sensitivity to me many, many years ago when we met in San Diego.
I had no idea. Oh,
And so you have a special place in my heart in my work because you really gave me this whole insight into myself and into the billion plus people walking around on the planet that are highly sensitive. And so you're, even just for that, you're a total gift. But I know that
oh, girl.
so
Thanks.
all of that. So
So sweet.
for people that are listening that don't have the pleasure of knowing you, can you share just a little bit about your work and what you do in the highly sensitive community?
Sure. I'm a marriage family therapist. I've been doing this for almost 15 years, and I'm a highly sensitive person myself. Um, in the therapist world, we're always taught, figure out your niche. Who's your population? What are you specializing in? And I had known I was a highly sensitive person probably since I was in my early 20s and was just trying to make sense of that and how does that change how I see myself. But as a therapist, I targeted anxiety and depression and addiction and eating disorders. And as I started to ask myself, who am I really passionate about serving? And I would think about the clients that I'd worked with that I just felt like, wow, we really clicked and made the most profound change. And I was like, what do these people have in common? And after a lot of asking myself and going, is it anxiety? No. Is it trauma? No. I realized, oh my goodness, these are highly sensitive people. And, oftentimes as therapists, the people we can best serve are people who we can relate to. And so once that clicked, I was like, oh my goodness, that makes so much sense. So, um, and over the years, I do trauma work with clients. I've really weaved that into working with highly sensitive people. And about 5 or so years ago, I love what I do. I love working in private practice. And I was really wanting to broaden my reach and seeing, as you said, there are over a billion people who are HSPs. I can see 20, 25 at a time. And I just wanted a way to have a broader reach. And so I started an online community called Intuitive Warrior, which I may have time to talk about today. Not my community, but the name Intuitive Warrior, which I find is a really nice positive reframe or another additional positive term to call ourselves, because Elaine Aron came up with the term high sensitivity just as a scientific term, neither positive nor negative, and yet there's such stigma on the word sensitivity. And so I wanted to really bring in this concept of our gifts and our resilience, which I'll talk about today. And so I now also work online in that forum with a blog and various programs for highly sensitive people.
Cool. I love so much about what you said. And as you're talking about Elaine Aron coining the term highly sensitive, it makes me laugh because often I'll hear people, especially once I've been working with them for a while, say, my child is too sensitive or extra sensitive. I'm like, no, 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 not too much, not extra. It's just enough. It's just right.
Yes.
Or it doesn't
Yes,
mean that it's too much. And so I
that's right.
love this idea of kind of reframing and really helping highly sensitive people come to accept who we are because and again, as you were talking about working with people that have anxiety and depression and eating disorders and addiction and trauma, I was like, oh, that all sounds like highly sensitive people because,
Mm.
correct me if I'm wrong, as highly sensitive people, we're more susceptible to those things. Would you say that that's true?
I'd say that's correct. I'm not sure what the research is with eating disorders, addiction. I'm not sure yet if there's solid research showing there's a higher percentage of people who struggle with that are highly sensitive than in the general population, the proportion. But that is my observation that we are more susceptible to trauma. We have these nervous systems that are picking up I'm guessing that the audience listening, that there's a broad variety of knowledge about HSP. So I'll maybe just review, and for some people it'll be like, of course I know that. But our nervous system is this is a very layman's description of it, non-scientific, but it's the way that we process the world. It's the way that we pick up what's happening in our environment. It's the way that we pick up what's happening within ourselves, in our physical body, in our emotions. And so that means that the world, our nervous system is more finely tuned than non-HSPs. And so we pick up our environment, we're impacted by our environment more powerfully than our non-HSPs. Trauma, the definition that I like of trauma, is something that is too overwhelming for our nervous system to process in the moment. So this is how I like to describe it to my clients. So the way our nervous system works is, let's say I'm walking along a sidewalk and a car lays on its horn, 5 feet behind me. I'm going to jump, right? I'm going to have a physiological reaction. I'm then going to have an emotional reaction. I'm going to have thoughts about it. Oh my gosh. And my nervous system is going to, what's called nervous system arousal. So it's going to start to get aroused. And that's it's the sympathetic nervous system where, you might sweat and your heart is beating. And then at a certain point, the nervous system will naturally peak and then come back down to baseline, right? Just because somebody honks behind me doesn't mean I'm going to be a nervous wreck for the next 5 years, right? And so that's what our nervous system does. It gets aroused and then it calms. And HSPs, our nervous system tends to get aroused more easily. It tends to spike more sharply and higher. And then it tends to take longer for us to come back down to baseline. So the interaction with trauma is when we're in an environment, whether we have something happen that is like a rape or combat, or we're in a car accident, something that is kind of all of a sudden thing, or it's something chronic where we grow up in an environment where there is chronic abuse or instability. Our nervous system is powerfully impacted by that, right? Everybody would be impacted by all those things that I said, but we are impacted even more intensely. And so because of that, we're more likely to have a nervous system response where we cannot process it. So to go back to that definition of trauma as something too intense for us to process in the moment, I like thinking of it as like, okay, something happens, our nervous system gets aroused, it gets really, really intense, and essentially it shoots off the chart. Like, it's so intense and so overwhelming that we cannot process it and come back down to baseline. And so what happens is that physical reaction in the body almost gets vacuum sealed in, and it gets held in the body. And so because we have those really sharp reactions more than non-HSPs, we are more likely to have that trauma response.
Yeah.
Is that clear?
Absolutely. Crystal clear. And the thing that I'm hearing from you is we have more frequent and more intense reactions to, let's say, unpleasant stimuli or fearful stimuli, things that will trigger our fight, fright, or freeze response. And
that's exactly right.
Because as highly sensitive people, we also have a tendency to process things deeply. When we have those experiences that are unprocessed, it's probably even more painful in a sense for us because we don't know what to do with them, and yet we so deeply want to process them and understand.
Yes, that's exactly right. And so we hold these pains in our hearts and our bodies so much more deeply, I would say, than non-HSPs. It affects us so profoundly. And that's when we go to things like addiction, right? If I'm holding all of this trauma in my body, right, aware of it or not, and I'm guessing some people listening are going to relate to this. They're not necessarily thinking all day, every day about the hard things they went through, but they get triggered sometimes, whether in relationship or something happens unexpectedly, and all of a sudden they're triggered. And it's like very, very intense. And so there's the trauma, and it comes up and then it drops back down under the surface. So when we're holding all of this unprocessed stuff, we have to do something with it. Sometimes it is so intense, it's hard to function, right? It can be impacting our day-to-day life. And that's where HSPs are really susceptible to turning to numbing out. And whether it's just a little thing, getting a coffee or getting a donut or something to just, you know what, I'm just going to kind of soothe myself right now. I'm going to ground myself. I don't want to feel this right now. All the way to chronic addiction, where somebody is smoking something, shooting something, drinking something, many hours of the day because they need to stay in that perpetual checked out state to just cope. And I wish, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say one other thing that I see a lot of these days is technology too.
Yes.
People are constantly on social media or online shopping. In other words, like anything that you're using that is keeping you from really feeling what you're feeling could be considered an addiction of sorts.
Oh, absolutely. And I think those are the hard ones to catch because, we're on social media for so many positive reasons, often connection, which is so good, or for business reasons. So it can be so hard to tease apart when am I numbing versus when am I just using this for enjoyment or practicality.
Yeah, totally. So I'm curious. So, well, I guess it's sort of a two-part question. Do you think everybody has trauma to some extent? And if so, what do we do about it? Like, if you're aware, like, oh yeah, I had a major trauma in my life. So, like you were talking about a rape or um, um, an accident or some sort of chronic trauma that you grew up with, or it could be lots of small little traumas over your lifetime. Things like horns and being frightened and hearing things like, you're not good enough, or these sort of micro traumas over time. What do we do about them once we're aware of them?
Sure. So I think I'll go personal for a moment just to give listeners some context for how I got into trauma and into trauma work and kind of my inside out understanding of it. So I grew up, I experienced a lot of trauma growing up. I had a dad who was very emotionally and verbally abusive. I had a mom who was highly sensitive and really amazing in a lot of ways, and yet in other ways was very entangled in this abusive relationship with my dad and wasn't able to protect me appropriately or create the safety that I needed. And so I emerged into adulthood highly, highly anxious, learned that I had very severe PTSD. And this was, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, before trauma is really having its moment right now as far as new modalities to treat trauma. And this was a little bit before that. And so I didn't understand. I just thought, what's wrong with me? Why am I so anxious? Why do my emotions get so intense? Why do I have these weird reactions that come out of nowhere and then I shut down? And stuff started to make so much sense to me when I understood, oh my goodness, having chronic emotional abuse is trauma. And that all of these symptoms that I'd been having was PTSD. It was incredibly validating to realize, oh yeah, that had an impact on me. And so the last, 15 years, I have been doing my own trauma healing work. And that really ties into why I'm speaking about resilience today, because I've personally had such a transformation and a realization that healing from trauma really is possible. And, that is part of my message, is both conveying that to people who don't realize that and think they just have to live with these painful wounds for the rest of their lives, And then also in the work that I do as a therapist, I actually do some of these trauma healing modalities with people. So to answer your question, I think trauma is a spectrum. And you're I'm sure familiar with attachment styles. I'm sure a lot of people listening though are not. And I think, let's see. Basically, I'd say everybody on this earth has, I would imagine, been traumatized to some degree. But what I mean by that, it could be somebody was 8 years old and he lives in a really supportive family. He feels safe to be himself. And he has this experience in second grade where kids start bullying him. And it's a one-time experience, but they call him names. They shove him into a locker. And he's incredibly frightened and traumatized. It is overwhelming for him. That is a trauma. And people tend to get into this bad habit of comparing trauma and going, that's not trauma. The war veteran, that's trauma. But if we go back to the definition of trauma being something that overwhelms your nervous system, well, that was traumatic for that kid. He was completely overwhelmed in that moment. So he has trauma. And then we can go, to the other end, to somebody who experiences, combat or sexual assault or physical assault or domestic violence or, oh my gosh, there's a million things, or something that a lot of people don't realize is trauma, is what I mentioned earlier, is chronic. It could be like in my household, my dad was not explosive every single day, but when you live in an environment where you don't know how somebody who is taking care of you is going to react, and they are explosive once a week or once a month, that is chronic trauma, and it is just as powerful as that single event. So I think that living on this earth, especially as highly sensitive people, we all have moments of trauma. And then I think some people have more what we call capital T trauma or chronic trauma.
Yeah. So since we've sort of established most, if not all, people have some trauma, and you mentioned a couple of healing modalities, what does that really look like? Like, okay, so if somebody listening is like, okay, yeah, I grew up in a household like that, or I was made fun of for crying, during a story when I was 6 years old at school, or some of these smaller T traumas. How does somebody move past it to, we've talked about this word resilience a couple of times now. How does somebody cultivate resilience? How do they heal that trauma and move into a place where they feel like they can handle life, where they feel like they're not being re-traumatized or kind of stunted in their adulthood because of this thing that happened when they were younger?
Oh, I have so many thoughts. I'm just trying to decide where to start. Well, let me say what I mean by resilience. It's the capacity to bounce back. And that's how I think of it. And most of us can bounce back, short term. For example, if I got in a car accident, most likely, if I'm physically okay, most likely I'm not going to stop functioning. But long term, because if that trauma was unresolved, it may impact me, and it may impact my everyday functioning. And so I'm talking about resilience as bouncing back, not just in the short term, like I'm fine, I can go to work now, but the capacity to really go in and uproot these things that hurt our heart and hurt our spirits and told us that it's not okay to be who we are. It's not okay to let our unique light shine. That is what the resilience that I really like to focus on with people, is that it is possible to clean out the things that have shut down our spirits, that have the wounds in us, to clean that out so that we bounce back as a whole as these amazing spirits, and we can then fully be ourselves as we were meant to be in the world. So that is the resilience that I love to preach, because I think many of us at some point are like, well, that's not possible. I'm never really going to be healed. So the best I can go for is having a fun night out, or having a day, a good day. And I've been there. And looking back, it's a sad way to live, because we're just going from okay moment to okay moment to okay moment with a lot of pain in between. And the place that I'm at now, and a lot of people I've worked at are at now, is more of a buoyancy of living up here. And yeah, we have dips, but the overall is, if not happy, meaningful, content, joyous, able to have the full range of our emotions. So that's clear?
Yeah.
Okay. So to go to your question of like, how do you get there, right? And when people come to me as a therapist, and they're hurting and they've got wounds, it's so common for them to be like, okay, what's the plan? How do we get there? Let's rip off the Band-Aid. I want to be there now. What's that?
Put me on the fast track.
Yes. And I'm always so empathetic, because one, I've been there. And two, it's like, of course, right? Oftentimes people have been suffering for a really long time by the time they come to therapy. And they're just like, I just want out. And so the thing that I always talk about to people as part of my role as a therapist is managing our pace. And managing our pace for the sake of somebody's nervous system. So I think that this is important, is that there's a lot of healing opportunities, and we need to do it in a way that our sensitive nervous systems can digest what we're healing. Because if we just go and rip off the Band-Aid, which it kind of drives me crazy, certain non-trained people will hold these retreats where they use these techniques that take people to the depths, which can often be their trauma. They rip it open in a very violent way. They are not equipped to actually help the person move through it. And then so someone's just sitting there now with an open wound. And so if someone comes into therapy or anything and just rips off the Band-Aid too quickly, then you're just being re-traumatized.
Right, because if I'm wrong here, it seems like what we're talking about right now, and I know you're going to elaborate more, is the therapeutic experience is the processing of the trauma, which is what
That's right.
As a sensitive person, it's not just to say, oh, here's the trauma, this is what happened, now I'm over it. It's like, no, this is what happened, and here's why it happened, and here's how it felt, and here's where I felt powerless, and here's what I need to do, and seeing it from new perspectives and removing that emotional charge.
That's right.
Process the experience, which is what our sensitive beings really, really need.
That's right.
So that now we're not just holding on to this unprocessed emotion anymore.
That's exactly right. I'll mention EMDR, the trauma modality that I practice. What it does is it accesses, so if you remember, our nervous systems came up here and it kind of went off the chart, and our body vacuum sealed all this traumatic stuff inside of it. The EMDR, and there's a couple other trauma modalities that do this, access all that vacuum sealed stuff, bring it back up to where we left off, where it was very intense, but in a non-re-traumatizing way. And it then helps our nervous system do what it naturally does, which is everything you said, which is start to process it in our heads, our hearts, our spirits. And then we come out the other side and it's cleaned out, and we're not in denial. We don't think this stuff didn't happen, but it doesn't hold the charge that it did. So I'll just going from there, there's what I did personally that was a real turning point for me, and it is also what I'm trained in now, is called EMDR. It stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And it's a empirically validated, highly respected trauma therapy. And it does just what I said. You have to be specially trained in it as a therapist, and it it accesses all of those wounds that are often rolling around in our unconscious. And it does it in a way that is powerful, but also gentle, not re-traumatizing. And it helps us to desensitize it and to be able to move forward. So anybody who's had capital T trauma, so again, something that was really, really big, jarring, or chronic trauma, whether it was really awful, horrific stuff over a long period of time, or less intense stuff, but over a long period of time, I cannot recommend enough that you seek out a trauma therapy. So like I said, there's EMDR. The other one I think highly of is called somatic experiencing. And oh, right. And so for those people who, like the boy that I gave the example of who was shoved into the locker, it's also appropriate for those, what some might consider a smaller T trauma, those things that are not, as earth shattering, but still really upsetting. It's absolutely effective for that. So really anybody who feels like you're holding onto stuff and cannot get past it, I highly recommend looking into somatic experiencing or EMDR.
Thank you for all that. I've personally also done EMDR therapy, and
Yeah.
I was just internally like jumping up and down as you were talking about this, because I didn't realize that I was carrying so much trauma. I
Yeah.
just thought like, oh, this is what happens in life. Like everybody's got hard stuff, and we all have moments of embarrassment and moments of shame and moments of powerlessness. And it never really occurred to me what effect those experiences really had on me until
Yes.
I was able to go back and reprocess them. And for me, one of the coolest things about EMDR, and I'm sure that you'll appreciate this as a practitioner and somebody who's experienced it, it actually felt to me with EMDR like when I started talking about a specific incident, like being shoved in a locker, which might not seem traumatic on the surface. If you've ever seen a clown at a circus kind of pull a handkerchief out of their mouth and then they keep pulling on it and this whole thing comes out, for me that's
Oh,
what EMDR felt like. It was like I started pulling on a memory and a feeling, and then all of a sudden I saw this whole line, this all of these dots of connection of little moments, of little memories that all had that same feeling of powerlessness or shame or embarrassment or not enoughness or too muchness. And
yeah.
it was almost like they got pulled out of my nervous system, and I could then see them and say, oh, that happened
Yeah.
here. Now you're over there and you're not inside kind of having
Yeah.
power over me anymore.
That with your permission, I'm going to use that visual. That is so powerful, and it so beautifully shows how our brilliant brains work. And I actually wonder if there's an HSP component with trauma because of the way that how brilliant our brains are at making connections and deep processing. Yeah, our heads our brains make associations. And so if I've had an experience where I felt not enough, and then here's an experience that's not enough, where I felt not enough, and another one over here, our brains will brilliantly group those. It'll package them up into what's called a traumatic memory network. And so that's another bonus of something like EMDR, is it's very quick, because let's say I have these 10 memories of profoundly feeling not enough. I won't need to go and do EMDR on every single memory because they're all connected in my brain and nervous system, right? So I may have to access one or two of them and they'll all get healed. Just like, yay.
Magic. Absolutely.
So, yeah, I'd love to go into a couple other things outside of therapy that people can do to cultivate resilience, as you said. So, to go back to what we were talking about in terms of numbing out, um, at the core of that is disconnecting from who we really are. And I did that for so many years. I mean, probably 13 through 25. I was floating outside of myself. And even when I was kind of connected to myself, I didn't see me, and that's part of abuse, is you're not seen. And so you can't see yourself. but I couldn't see my gifts. And I know so many people will relate to this of thinking, what's wrong with me? I'm, this sensitivity, I'm defective. Why am I so sensitive? This is a curse. Why can't I get over it? And trauma tends to, when we go through hard things, we are susceptible to having that same reaction of feeling ashamed when we've experienced trauma. And so the number one important thing for people who are holding shame or trauma is to start creating safety in your life. Start creating places or people where you can feel safe to let down your guard and be in your body, be in your emotions, and not feel that feeling of, I'm not safe, I'm not comfortable, so I have to escape myself. Without the capacity to start feeling that, it's really hard to even pursue therapy, right? Because therapy is really asking us to come back into ourselves. So I just can't encourage people enough to start asking yourself, who in my life and where in my life do I really feel safe? And that could be with an animal, right? As much as with a person, or it could be a special place that you like to go. And looking, if you say, there's actually nobody, then that's really profound, right? And that alone might be a reason to seek some therapy. Is, gosh, how lonely that is, to feel disconnected from both yourself and others.
Absolutely.
When we can connect to ourselves, then we can connect to our vulnerability, which is where our intuition lives. And to go to my name, Intuitive Warriors, I see our intuition as one of our biggest gifts and our avenues to resilience. And I think of intuition as an unconscious knowing. It's this awareness that I have about myself, about the world, and I couldn't exactly tell you how I know it, but I just do. And, the thought is that somewhere in my unconscious, I've connected some dots, but it's not a conscious awareness. So I just have that sense. And I think that is an HSP superpower. That intuition, I think sometimes it even taps into something that's greater than ourselves. There are sometimes things that I know, I'm guessing you've experienced this too, where I'm like, I don't know where that came from. And that I just had a wisdom or a knowing that actually feels bigger than my own level of wisdom. So I think our intuition is where we tap into spirituality. It's where we tap into God or a higher power or the universe, something bigger than ourselves. And so someone's coming to my door. They don't ring the doorbell. Okay. So when we're in a lot of pain and we disconnect from ourselves, we also disconnect from our intuition, which is in my opinion, our best compass and our best guidance system. And so when we start being willing to reconnect with ourselves, find other people who we can be real with, we start regaining the capacity to connect with our inner knowing. And to me, that is also at the heart of resilience. Because at least in my journey and a lot of those who I've seen, when I can connect to my inner knowing, there's much less confusion. There's so much more clarity. There's so much more strength. And to me, that reconnection with ourselves and our intuition is really the doorway into healing. So I could go on and on. I'm aware of our time, so I'm going to stop there. But
I so appreciate it, and I couldn't agree more. I also think that when we're in so much pain, it's because we're not connected to that. That is what causes that pain. It's the disconnection from ourselves, and it is painful to be disconnected from ourselves.
Oh yes.
It's painful to be living in isolation where there's no one that we feel safe with.
Yes.
And so if we have a tribe around us, that we feel safe and connected with, chances are pretty good that we're not going to feel that much pain and that disassociation, because
Yes.
we've got anchors in our life. We've got these sort of safe lighthouses that we can use as anchors.
Yes.
And I totally agree with you. If somebody listening to this is saying, I don't have anything safe or anyone safe in my life, I agree that therapy is a really wonderful place to start, because if you work with a good therapist, because not all therapists are as good as others,
Amen.
but finding a good therapist who understands high sensitivity and who's trained in EMDR is, it is a lighthouse. It is absolutely a
Yeah.
pain and disconnection. And there was something else that you had said when you were talking about resilience that I just wanted to kind of put an exclamation point at the end of, which is, I know it's true for me, and I believe it's true for you, just kind of based on knowing you and hearing some of what you shared today, that our early childhood traumas are very often actually a catalyst for us to become resilient adults who go out and do specific work. I know I would not be working with parents of highly sensitive children if I felt totally understood in my childhood, if I had been fully nurtured and supported in the way that I help parents try to do for their own children. But
Yes.
it's because I felt misunderstood and judged that I now do the work that I do. And so I'm using the trauma that I experienced. I like to think about it as sort of an arrow, like a bow and arrow that gets pulled back. The trauma is sort of the pullback. And then
Mm.
once we do the healing, we get to take that launch. And that for me is the real resilience. It's following that launch and letting it catapult us into our purpose for being here, into our real passion and work. And some people, it seems, their trauma pulls them back so far that they break and they're never really able to take that launch. And it is really heartbreaking to be witness to that happen. And of course it's going to happen because there are billions and billions of us, and we can't control anybody else's journey. But for me personally, I always like to reassure parents who are worried that they've traumatized their children or really messed things up, that they've just helped their child sort of take this launch. And that once, whether it's in childhood or in adulthood, we start to do that healing work,
Yes.
we process whatever it is that we've experienced, it's actually a portal into us going out into the world and helping others, and really having a voice and using that experience as fuel to move forward.
Oh, that's so beautiful. I love that metaphor of the arrow. And I couldn't agree more. And I think you and I are both really highlighting this. Doing your healing work is so important, because here's the thing, is that when we're wounded, sometimes we're wounded so badly that we go into a just numb, complete shutdown state. Most of us, though, are still out in the world, functioning, and we bring those wounds everywhere. And we bring them into our relationships and into our workplaces and to our partners and to our kids. And, what can happen, I've seen this a lot with therapists, is, one term that I think a lot of therapists relate to is wounded healers. And so we've had these experiences as children, young adults, who have made us actually even more empathetic. And I want to, if we have a moment, I'd like to speak to why that is. Um, for example, I had to be too emotionally mature. I was kind of the therapist of the family, and that was inappropriate. And so a lot of times those roles as kids, we just get launched right into that as an adult. And if I never did my healing work, I'd be bringing all that yucky, wounded, unresolved stuff to my clients. And so whether it's therapist or whether it's whoever's listening, just them as a parent or them as a friend or a partner, cleaning out those wounds will allow that arrow to fly, and then for you to be able to use those wounds as your gifts rather than just repeating the wounds unconsciously. And so the caveat is, or the other thing I'd like to mention is, in my observation, one other thing that people really need to start learning about if they're resonating with the stuff I'm talking about is boundaries, how to set boundaries. And I'm not just talking about in relationship, like, no, I need to stop now because this is when our time ends. I'm talking about emotional boundaries. I'm talking about energetic boundaries. And when we're sensitive, I have a feeling you've thought a lot about this. When we're sensitive and we grow up in an environment that in some way wasn't safe or wasn't supportive, we had to kind of have our own back. And so as kids, we learn to use our gift to tune in to our environment. And so what should have happened was, yeah, I'm really astute and attuned, but I'm also feel safe enough that I don't have to have my feelers out all the time. But in my home and in many, many people's homes, it was not safe enough. And so I had to develop this almost sixth sense, just this empathy to the nth degree where I know where everybody's at and how everybody's feeling. And I am constantly looking for danger,
like a hyper vigilance.
a hyper vigilance. And so then a lot of people come to me and they're talking about that, and I can feel everybody's feelings, and it's ruining, it's ruining my life essentially because I'm taking it all on. And is that sensitivity? And I, in recent years, actually have come to believe that's not. I believe that's high sensitivity plus being in an unsafe environment that kind of blew out our boundaries as sensitive people. And so another part of resilience and healing is learning, where did that happen? Why did that happen? And actually healing our inner child for him or her to learn, I don't actually need to do that anymore. That really helped back then, but now I'm just having a conversation with Melissa. I don't need to zoom in to everything that's going on inside of her, right? So it's really setting those energetic boundaries is another massive turning point for most HSPs.
Yeah. And the other thing that I'm realizing as we're talking about this is being highly sensitive is sort of the umbrella that we're talking about. And then within that, there's so much that we all uniquely experience that
Yes.
creates our lens as adults that we all really deserve, I believe, to work with a good therapist who can help us pull out all of the pieces and sort out where any anxiety or trauma or worry or depression or numbing out emotions is coming from, because each of us has our own story, our own experience, and we all deserve to live with what I would call success, which is navigating our emotions, all of our emotions, and being able to handle whatever it is that comes up. And I think what happens is, for so many of us, we have these challenging experiences, or we live with a chronic state that isn't supportive for us. And so we learn to compartmentalize which emotions we'll allow, and we respond to certain emotions in certain ways, and we develop patterns. And when we can sort of step out of that with a really loving, validating person, somebody who's affirming where we are, not condoning it, not helping us to accept that this is the way that it is, but lovingly holding space for us to process. I mean, that's really what my takeaway from this conversation is that when we can process in a safe way whatever it is that we've experienced, then we become free of the power that it's had on us. And that really seems like the key. And we sort of talked about it in the beginning. It seems like as highly sensitive people, we're so hungry for that processing. We just crave this understanding and unraveling of how things come to be. And so having someone lovingly support us in doing that is such a gift to ourselves and to the world, because an emotionally healthy, resilient, successful, highly sensitive person is an unstoppable force for good on this planet.
Oh my gosh, yes. I couldn't have said that better. Beautiful. I agree with all of that.
Well, thank you so much, Brooke. I really appreciate you being here, and
my pleasure.
That you catalyzed in my life, and lucky your clients are to be able to use you as a resource to reprocess any trauma that they have. It's a gift that you provide them.
Oh, thank you so much, Melissa. I love this.
Thanks, Brooke.
All right. Take care. Bye.